A warm welcome, everyone, to the Swiss breakout session today from our beautiful office here in Zurich. My name is Sasha, and I'm with EQS now for more than 5 years. I lead our compliance services here at EQS in Switzerland. I will moderate the session today, and want to thank you once again for being part of ECEC 220, and especially for joining the Swiss breakout session. Our topic today, as you know, will be employee interviews, best practices, lessons learned in Swiss corporate internal investigations. During these sessions, our experts will give you an insight on the legal and practical aspects of employee interviews during internal investigations. Furthermore, we best practices and lessons learned when interviewing employees and explain how to adhere to Swiss employment and data privacy laws. Before I introduce you to our excellent jury of leading Swiss experts, I would like to draw your attention to our Swiss poll question to make this session as engaging as possible. We would like to know the following from you. You can see the poll question on the right side. Have you ever been involved in an interview in connection with an internal investigation? Yes, as a target, yes, as a witness, yes, as an interviewer, or no. Please answer the poll question now, and I'm going to present the results to you in a few minutes. Perfect. Now, I'm very happy to introduce you to our speakers. We are very excited, actually, and extremely grateful for the comment all of the three speakers. Let me start with Daniel. Daniel is counsel at the Swiss law firm Wenger Vieli, with 15 years of experience in-house with the regulator in private practice. He works mainly in the areas of banking, financial, market law, white-collar crime, compliance, and internal investigations. Thank you, Daniel. Oliver, also great that you're here. He joined FIFA in 2008, and in September 2016, Oliver was appointed as Director of Integrity and Institutional Law Legal. In his position, he oversaw all integrity and institutional matters and has been supervising internal investigations as well as litigation before ordinary courts and arbitration tribunals, both nationally and internationally. In June 2020, he was appointed as Director of Integrity and Anti-Doping and currently oversees all of FIFA's activities in the field of integrity and anti-doping. Thank you, Oliver. And last but not least, Paul Williams, Head of Business Integrity at LafargeHolcim, global leader in building materials and solutions, more than 70,000 employees around the world. Paul joined LafargeHolcim in 2019, and as Head of Business Integrity, Paul is actually responsible for global investigations across the LafargeHolcim group and leads the team based in the group's headquarters in Zug in Switzerland. We're looking forward to the exciting presentations of all the speakers. But before I hand over to the speakers, let's quickly have a look to the poll results. As you can see them, Daniel, I think as a next step, I will hand over to you. What do you think about the results?
Yes, many thanks, Sasha. I just checking. So we have a lot of people, almost half of the audience was involved in an internal investigation interview as an interviewer. Around 34% have not been involved. The rest was actually a target of an investigation or an interview at least. And I think now it's time for the deep dive. And here we have our agenda for today. In the first part, I will speak about the Swiss legal framework for data review and employee interviews with internal investigations. Then Oliver will take over and give us an introduction in connection with effective investigation interviews, skills and methods. And finally, Paul Williams will speak about challenging interview situations, what strategies and techniques you can use there to master such situations. Well, part one, the legal framework. A quick overview about what I'm going to discuss. After a quick introduction, I will first speak about document collection and review. because this is one of the cornerstones of every investigation. I will then move on with employee interviews and draw a conclusion at the end. Internal investigations in Switzerland. As you maybe know, internal investigations, they origin from the US and other countries like the UK and in Switzerland. Over the last 10 years, they became actually very popular because corporate decision makers, shareholders, and investigative governmental agencies, such as the DOJ or the Swiss FINMA, they demand that Swiss corporations conduct internal investigation if there's a strong suspicion of fraud or other illegal activity. The Swiss regulator FINMA, who is supervising banks and insurance companies, it has recently directed that the compliance function at Swiss Bank must include the duty and responsibility of reporting serious compliance breaches and matters with far-reaching implications in a timely manner to the executive board and the board of directors. And that means you need to do an investigation to actually fulfill this duty. So the need to conduct an internal investigation may also arise from the general duty of the employer and senior manager to appropriately manage your risks, your compliance risk, and that you supervise and control employees and internal processes within the organization. And if you do, no, it's not moving. So yes, so if you do a proper investigation, it helps you to determine if the suspicion of fraud or other illegal activity has merit, who is involved in the wrongdoing and to what degree, what is the appropriate internal to your employees or external, let's say shareholders or media response, including the risk associated if you don't make a response. So, and you also learn how to minimize your civil, regulatory, and criminal exposure of the corporation, including the decision makers, and what preventive measures apply to actually stop the repetition of the activity, and how you can actually minimize the reputation. Today in my presentation, I will focus on data review and interviews with employees and how information gathering, specifically the way of interviews, should be conducted. So, document collection and review. The first stage of information gathering of an internal investigation is, of course, document collection and review. So relevant documents are crucial to virtually any investigation, and they form the basis on which employee interviews can be conducted, and at the second stage of the information gathering process. So document reviews regularly provide you with a detailed historical background, and they also are independent evidence for the investigative team it can use to assess the recollection or the candor of your employees. On the Swiss law, one of the key principles of the whole entire information gathering process is a distinction between business-related and private communication. This is absolutely key. Because business communication, it may be collected, analyzed, and reviewed by the employer, and of course the investigative team, with no information or consent from the employee. So business communication, it includes physical documents, and of course nowadays, what's way more important, electronic communications, in particular emails and chats. So business communication may be processed even though it's personal employee data. The employer must, however, respect Swiss data protection law. In particular, he must only process personal data in good faith and in a proportionate way. And exactly the principle of proportionality is very important. And it's, of course, a vague term. But for instance, if you do an email review, you need to use specific search terms. The review of private communication is a bit more difficult because it may not be collected, analyzed, or reviewed. However, sometimes when you look at emails, you don't know at the beginning if they're private or business related. So the private use of company resources is usually limited, so that it means you can only use business email for business purpose. However, if your employees start using their business email for private purposes, you still may assume that it's business-related communication because it's on the business mail server. So the employee may process this information, but as soon as it becomes apparent that it is not business communication, he has to stop. So he cannot collect or review private communication, even though it's on the business email server. That brings me to the employee interviews. So document collection and review provide the investigative team with documentary evidence, and more importantly, it helps to identify unknown elements of the investigation. Of course, if facts remain unclear, and when the document reviews results in a contradictory information, if you have black spots. So employee interviews are a crucial investigative step, and they serve the main purpose to supplementing the information you found during the document review phase and clarifying any black spots. Most importantly, of course, many employees, they have no interest to participate in interviews. They do not want to become the focus of the internal investigation, and they don't want to rattle out their colleagues. So this is usually the setup, and Oliver and Paul will speak more about this situation. From a legal point of view, the employee, he has a duty to participate in the interview. So employees must carry out the work assigned to them with due care and must loyally safeguard the employer's legitimate interests. Under this, they have to attend an interview. So the employer decides by means of a specific instruction when and where an employee shall participate in an interview. So the employee in Switzerland, he must comply in good faith and participate in interviews, whether in his capacity as a witness or as a suspect of the investigation. If he does not comply with these instructions, he or she breaches the employee's obligations under the employment contract and the duty of loyalty towards the employer. As a consequence, for instance, for a no-show in an interview, the employer may impose disciplinary measures on the employee, such as an oral warning, a written warning, and as ultima ratio, the termination of the employment contract. There are specific limitations in Switzerland in connection with the employee's duty to participate in interviews, which may derive from the employee's duty to safeguard the employee's personal rights. I'll talk about that in a little while. The employee has also a duty to provide complete and truthful information. So it means that he must cooperate with the employer and help and assisting to establish the facts. However, it really matters if the employee is interviewed as a suspect or as a witness. If the employee is interviewed as a suspect, certain limitations to the employee's duty of loyalty may derive from A, the privilege against self-incrimination, also called the nemo tenetur principle, then the privacy safeguards to protect the employee's private sphere, and the employee's duty of care and protection towards the employee. So on the one hand, you have the duty of loyalty of the employee, who needs to show up in interviews, who needs to provide truthful information. On the other hand, you have the employee who actually needs to take care of his employees. And this is a balance which is not always easy to reach. However, and that's a very important key point in Swiss employment law, the employee has no right to refuse on the privilege against self-incrimination. And according to recent case law of the Swiss Federal Supreme Court, this and other privileges to remain silent and Miranda warnings, they only apply if you are in a governmental investigation, and there's no third-party effect into private or corporate internal investigations. That's a key principle. The next step is then, if the evidence you as a corporation, by doing interviews, you gathered during the interviews, if you want to use that after or later in a criminal proceeding, for instance, against a third party or against employee him or herself, you have to make sure that you meet certain criteria, such that you have a signature of the employee below the minutes, or that you actually told him at the beginning what the whole interview is all about. That's exactly what I want to tell you a little bit more on my next slide. So, although under Swiss law no statutory obligation exists for these rights and duties, there is this general duty of care of the employer. It's very vague. What is duty of care? However, in Swiss internal investigation, it emerged that it is best practice to inform the employee at the outset of the interview at the minimum about the following. You tell him or you tell her who is participating in the interview, that the reasons, the background, and the purpose of the interview, why she or he is here. And if you have an outside counsel attending the interview, you must clarify the so-called upjohn warning, who the counsel is representing, because he's not representing the employee, but he's representing the company. And if there are really severe suspicions, you maybe will tell him that he needs a lawyer. And at the very end, the interviewer must also explain that notes will be taken during the interview. This brings me to the conclusion, which I think is very important. The information gathering and review phase is fundamental to every corporate internal investigation because it forms the factual basis of the final report. You decide what kind of legal actions you take, and it provides you with evidence which might become relevant later in any proceeding. It's therefore crucial that the data collection and interview phase is conducted in a structured and also legally compliant way, that you have a robust foundation for the internal investigation and the final report. At the very end, I think if you interview fair, if you cooperate, if you are transparent, this should be your guiding principles. Then you will have a robust foundation for internal investigation, and the interview, and we'll speak later about that, is a very helpful thing for them having the final report ready. Yes, this is it. So I will hand over to Oli about effective investigation interviews, skills and method. Oli, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And, hello to everyone. It is a pleasure for me to be with you this afternoon. And I'd like to have a quick look first at what we should cover in the next few minutes. So first, I'd like to provide some background on interviews. After that, we'll have a look at some key theoretical aspects before we then dive into some practical issues of conducting the actual interview. Eventually, I'll summarize and share some key takeaways. So let's get started. Interviews, what are they? They represent the most basic and human element of any internal investigation and are a key investigative step. They are an essential part of most corporate investigations, while documentary evidence can provide the underlying facts of a case. It is in the accounts given by witnesses and other interviewees that deliver the context and detail of what has happened. So before diving a bit more into the theoretic aspects and having a look at some key skills and methods of conducting interviews, let's quickly recall that interviews can serve a number of different purposes in relation to corporate investigations, including to scope the investigation. Such interviews are used to evaluate, ground, and refine the initial understandings, assumptions, and concepts, but also to understand the facts and issues The objectives of such interviews are to try to put together what actually happened, so to establish the facts. Also, interviews serve to understand the accountability and defenses of in relation with the interviewees. And last but not least, they serve to assess the credibility of individuals and their accounts. So with regard to investigative interviewing, what is this? According to the UK College of Policing, investigative interviewing is central to the success of an investigation, and the highest standards need to be upheld. So this serves to direct and investigations, gathering additional material, but it is also key in supporting an investigation, saving time, money, and resources. So the effectiveness of the interview is key here. Yet, investigative interviewing is not cross-examination or interrogation. It is, however, quite common to combine interview techniques with interrogation tactics. So, having a quick look at the principles of investigative interviewing, from our perspective, it is key to obtain accurate and reliable accounts, to act fairly, then also to test the accounts against information that is already known, ask a wide range of questions, and last but not least, remember that you are, as the interviewer, not bound to accept the first answer given. Also, a theoretical aspect that I think is important is to speak about impressions very quickly. So be aware that people form immediate impressions of each other within the first 5 seconds of a meeting. And more importantly, even is that people have generally set their views within 5 minutes. So you to appear favorable rather than unfavorable, meaning to appear friendly, professional, helpful, genuine, and sincere, as opposed to appearing superficial, disinterested, or bored while you interview in the context of an internal investigation. In that context, an important aspect is that good interviewing requires building and maintaining of rapport, and this may be achieved in the first instance through natural behavior, authentic behavior. So watch your appearance, greet your interviewee with a handshake, mind the use of the language that you use, be natural. Also, you may want to start discussing neutral topics such as, ask the interviewee to break the ice where he's been or she has been. Tell him that you like your tie, where he got it from, etc. So, in that context, I think the way is to that interviewees rarely open up to interviewers they do not trust or like. So it is important to allow yourself to display personality and eventually to be human. The impression, behavior, so smile, be open, also greet the interviewee in a friendly manner, maintain eye contact, nods, making non-verbal signs is a strong message, and eventually also summarize the answers to ensure you understand, and importantly, to demonstrate that you are actively listening. So when interviewing, there are different types of questions. There are open-ended questions, so-called TED questions. You would start with tell me, explain, describe. These questions are helpful at the beginning of an interview as they allow for a full and unrestricted account and produce answers which are less likely to have been influenced by the interviewer, by you as an interviewer. Then there is also specific closed questions, for example, who did it? What did he say? When did this happen? This type of questions give the interviewer more control, may be used to elicit information that the interviewee has not yet provided in response to open-ended questions, and is used to clarify and extend an account. What you want to avoid is to ask forced choice questions or multiple questions because they just create confusion. So if you ask too many questions at a time, such as, for example, what happened after the call, where did you go, who did you speak to, this will not help you in establishing the facts and getting unambiguous information. Then when it comes to questioning itself, there are some key rules to be observed. From my perspective, in particular, you should, keep your questioning conversational, use simple language, ask one question at a time, and also summarize key points and do not topic hop. So explain any transition when moving from one topic to another. Also helpful is to listen actively and to show that you follow. And you can do that by verbal and also non-verbal encouragers. I have listed some here. Also, you may, try to repeat the last 3 or 4 words the interviewee said, use utterances, and nod with your head. Also, you would like maybe to paraphrase, put the thoughts in that and feed them back to the interviewee. Also, avoid disagreements, use common ground, and eventually also allow for emotions to be part of a interview. Lying very quickly. There is different indicators that would lead you to conclude that you should dig deeper, that there might be that the interviewee might not be telling the truth. A thin account with significant jumps and a lack of detail is one indicator. There are others that I have listed here, social justification, but everyone does it. Might also indicate that someone is not telling the truth. And there is also different ways to maybe challenge that and verify. And you may consider asking the interviewee to recall the events in reverse order. Now, having a bit of a closer look in the next few minutes at conducting the actual interview, a technique that has been established is the PEACE technique of interviewing: planning and preparing, engaging, explaining, then also with regards to account, clarify, challenge, eventually close and evaluate. So having a bit of a closer look with regard to the planning and preparation. In the first, you would establish an interview plan, which is a written document. You would draft the questions in writing in advance of the interview. You would also determine the interview location, the resources, the timing, the objectives of the interview, and further aspects such as the plan for dealing with other incidents, allegations as necessary, and also remember to keep a copy of the interview plan for future reference. Always, and this is important, key, there are at least 2 interviewers who attend the interview, the lead interviewer and the second interviewer. So whereas the lead interviewer would have the most interaction with the interviewee and build rapport, ask the questions, challenge the interviewee, and eventually close the interviewee. The second interviewer creates the notes of the interview. He listens carefully for contradictory statements, hesitations, drop in detail, etc., and would then eventually compile minutes of interview. Then during the actual interview, you would engage and explain. So meaning that you would encourage the interviewee to talk. The beginning of an interview is also the opportunity to build rapport, make the introduction conversational, explain the purpose of the interview, and also manage the expectations and you know, the nerves, meaning almost everyone gets nervous before an interview. So control your breathing, follow the introduction, remember your topics, and the rest will take care of itself. With regard to account, you would invite the interviewee to provide a free and uninterrupted recall. And here the key rule is do not interrupt. Do not interrupt the interviewee and do not ask any questions during the recall. Only do that at a later stage. At this stage, you would listen very carefully and remember key points, and also engage the interviewee through different activities. Then you might want to challenge the account and put inconsistencies to the interviewee, and also in that context, remember the challenge phase in a robust manner, plan for a change in relationship, and also when doing the challenge, start with the weakest challenge, building up to the strongest. I have listed here, but I think we can skip that, the different kinds of challenges, internal, external, and then also how to proceed when delivering the challenge. But importantly, I think is the closer phase of the interview, where you would verify that all aspects have been sufficiently covered, explain what happens next, invite questions or comments, maybe consider holding a difficult question back for this point, the so-called Columbo. Remember to leave the door open. You want to ensure that the interviewee has the contact details and the possibility, the opportunity to get back to you with additional information that he might consider is important to share with you as the interview at a later stage. Eventually, do not make promises, and shake hands and share a smile. Also, after the interview has been closed, there is the evaluation phase. And in this context, I think it's important to recall that originals should be kept as well. So summarizing and having a look at takeaways, I mean, we as interviewers should be thorough. We should be patient. We don't make promises. Remember that the first impression counts. You are in charge of the interview, not the interviewee or not its counsel. Be genuine and sincere. Use your strengths. Take accurate notes and keep the originals. Ask the tough questions. Don't be afraid of asking them. Live with the answers. And eventually, from my perspective, the most important one, be well prepared. And having said that, I would like to hand over to Paul, who will provide us with information on challenging interview situations and strategies and techniques in that context. Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Oliver. Right, well, let's look at some challenging situations now. Right, some strategies and techniques to deal with some interview challenges. There's a few challenges that you'll probably have encountered, and I'm pleased to see that around half of the participants have been involved in an investigation as interviewer. So you will probably be familiar with a number of these situations, and indeed you may have had situations that I haven't had that I'm not going to cover. But let's just have a look at some of the type of situations that we can encounter. So, interviewee does not cooperate. It's quite a common one for people just not to cooperate. Interviewee may say, well, I'm going to cooperate, but I want to impose some conditions. One of those might be immunity or amnesty, or having a lawyer present. So we'll look into those. You might have other issues associated with external investigations or legal proceedings that you have to bear in mind when you're dealing with interviews, and these all interrelate to how we deal with the interviewee and how cooperative they are. Okay, so let's look at non-cooperation. And there's a lot of reasons for non-cooperation, and some of those can be cultural, some of those can be business related, some of those may indicate guilt or culpability. So, somebody might just say, well, I just don't have anything to say. I don't have anything to say. I just can't remember anything. These types of things come up quite frequently. I just don't remember. It was a long time ago. Maybe it would not be appropriate for me to comment. So perhaps they do know something. They don't feel like saying something. I refuse to speak badly of somebody. And I think this is a really important factor in many cultures in Europe and elsewhere, that people simply think it's not on to speak badly about a co-worker, and they simply don't want to denounce a colleague. It's just ratting on them. And it's a cultural issue in many places, and it's understandable. And we have to be aware of that. And I've certainly had it many times where people have said, look, I just refuse to cooperate because I'm not going to speak badly of person X, and that's it. Then we have, for example, don't ask me. I'm not really the one that knows about this. You need to ask somebody else. So there's no point talking to me. Then you have, well, you're not public, so I'm not talking to you. I'm only talking to the authorities if I have to. And then, well, I would like to help. Of course, I would like to cooperate, but I can't say anything because I have a legal right to silence, which Daniel has already touched on. So, I'd like to cooperate, but I want my lawyer present. So these are all situations that we sometimes may encounter. So let's first refuse where someone says, I just refuse to cooperate. I won't help. First, you have to understand, what are the reasons for that? Is it a fear of retaliation or negative consequences? Is it a cultural issue, as I mentioned? Is it trying to hide something? Relying on a legitimate right to silence, possibly with advice from a lawyer? So there could be reasons, but equally, cooperation tends to make sense. Aside from legal obligations, which Daniel mentioned, which apply in many jurisdictions or most jurisdictions, cooperation tends to be the interviewee's best chance to give their version of events. If we don't hear it from them, we might hear it from other people, and it might not be such a positive story. We may also draw wrong or incomplete conclusions if we don't hear their version of events, and that's not necessarily going to help them. And the fact is, the interviewee, if the interviewee doesn't talk to us, the interviewee won't find out what else we know. That doesn't mean we're going to tell them everything we know, but we may at least put to them, look, another person has accused you of something. What do you have to say about that? Do you reject it or not? And they won't know that if they don't cooperate. Okay, right. So, reasons why we think an interviewee should cooperate. Now, if we look into specific issues such as relying on the right to silence, Daniel's already mentioned this, of course, and in most jurisdictions there is a right to silence to avoid self-incrimination in criminal proceedings, but it depends on whether you're a suspect. It doesn't generally cover witnesses who are not suspects. So, witnesses do have to cooperate and do have to give evidence. And so to say, well, I don't have to say anything is not normally the case unless you're the suspect. and as Daniel mentioned, employees have a duty to cooperate, and that particularly includes cooperation with internal investigations. Some employees might say, well, it's not number one priority. It's not the target I've been set by my manager. So it's, maybe I'll cooperate, but I don't have time right now. That doesn't really work. They have to prioritize it. And failure to cooperate may be a disciplinary matter. So, of course, as Daniel mentioned, we can't advise, the company and its lawyers can't advise an employee on the employee's potential liability or a right to silence. The employee would need to obtain independent legal advice and therefore possibly be given an upjohn warning, as Daniel mentioned. Right. But really, the employee should be encouraged to cooperate. Now, there may be limited cooperation. The employee says, yeah, I'm going to help you, but I'm worried about something. Or I'm going to, they give partial answers. Again, evasive answers, unclear or contradictory statements. Challenge the interviewer and say, look, I don't really think what you're talking about, or I don't think you're really competent, or I don't think you've got any experience in this field. You're an investigator or a lawyer and you don't understand the business, and therefore, frankly, your questions are irrelevant. So in all of these cases, we have to try and work out what's behind this. There's strategies to deal with this, of course. First thing is don't be sidetracked. Don't get diverted into irrelevant topics. Don't rise to challenges to your authority. Simply persist. You're doing your job. It's your job to find out facts. You need to know the facts. So I think it's just, be persistent. If there are contradictions, point them out diplomatically. Don't make the interviewee feel that they're being challenged. Feel that that you need their help to understand something. Something is unclear, and they are the person with the know-how that can help you, and you need that help. It needs to be as positive as possible to get the most out of them. And obviously use relevant documents to show the issues. Again, if the employee can explain the document, it's much better than if they just say, I refuse to say anything. Now, one of the common, or maybe not so common issues, but we're in a serious situation, there may be potential disciplinary consequences coming up quite early and quite obviously going to happen. And so what you may get is that the employee, either the subject or another interviewee, simply resigns for whatever reason. Now, if the person resigns before the interview, then you can't force them to be interviewed if they're no longer an employee. One interesting issue is, are they allowed to resign? To resign with immediate effect with no notice period, and that varies according to the jurisdiction you're in. So that's an important point to check. Can they just say, well, I'm going to resign the day before the interview and then I don't have to turn up? And that can be the case in some jurisdictions. Maybe there's even a contractual commitment to continue cooperation after leaving the company, although that's probably unlikely and it may be hard to enforce. Otherwise, it's on a voluntary basis, but they should have the same reason to cooperate. Employees may say, I'd like an amnesty. I don't want disciplinary action. I don't want the matter reported to authorities. Now, of course, these kind of requirements present the company with various issues. If there's a request for an amnesty, I say the interview says, I want an amnesty. Otherwise, I'm going to the press, something like that. We can't agree to an amnesty generally. We can't protect them from prosecution. The company has to say, look, we can't make a commitment there. The company can do its best to keep confidentiality or anonymity, but the company can't agree to prevent a prosecution or not cooperate with the prosecution. And, it's unwise to give them an amnesty unless you really know all the facts and unless you're prepared to do the same for all employees in the same situation. Otherwise, it could be a ground for a lawsuit for unfair dismissal or some form of discrimination. And so it's the same with not reporting to police authorities. The company cannot make a commitment not to report to authorities because there may be an obligation to do so, and it may be in the company's interest to do so. So really, that example of a couple of the interview issues you have. The final one being insisting on a lawyer being present. We would normally, as a company, I think we would discourage that. The interviewee has always the right to obtain legal advice separately in their own time. But normally having a lawyer present at the interview isn't really the idea. It's not something that should be encouraged unless there's a legal right to have a lawyer present, which there may be in some countries. Okay, so In view of the limited time, I'm now going to hand back to Sasha. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, Oliver, and Daniel for your presentations. It was really interesting for me, very exciting to get an insight into lessons learned during internal investigations in Switzerland. You gave us a brilliant overview in these various areas, so thank you very much again. Well, our last point on the agenda is a Q&A session. We already received lots of questions. Thank you very much for your participation. And I guess we should start with the first question. First question to the round, gentlemen. What do you think is a fair interview in an internal investigation? Maybe Daniel, what do you think?
I mean, as I mentioned in my presentation, I think it's about the balance. On the one hand, you have the company who wants to establish the facts, who wants to uncover the truth. And for this, I mean, you have to ask the questions and you have the right to ask them. On the other hand, you have the employee who actually has a duty of loyalty and he needs to cooperate. And there you have to find a balance. And in my opinion, fair interviews are if you have a structured process, if you have rules, if you at the beginning tell them why they're here, and that the whole process is fair and transparent, maybe written down in an investigation policy or an employee knows how to conduct interviews. So you have a standard how to do interviews. And standardization is then because you treat everyone the same way. This leads for me also to fair interviews.
Great. The round. Any other remarks? Otherwise, we have lots of other questions. I like the next question. How do you best manage a virtual interview, phone interview, in contrast to in-person meeting? I mean, that's a really good question, especially now during the Corona times. Who would like to answer that question or give some ideas? Oliver, what do you think? I think you're on mute.
Oli, we don't hear you, Oli.
Thank you. Sorry for that. No, I think there's different aspects to be taken into consideration. I mean, starting with logistical aspects, make sure that you know, the technical infrastructure works. Consider what provider you use. Maybe you want to ensure that the provider that you use only stores the data in specific jurisdictions. Then also in general, data protection, data privacy aspects, of course, have particular relevance in the context of interviews being conducted in a virtual manner. Challenges I see is, you know, the building of the rapport, the building of the relationship with the interviewee. This is usually easier when you meet face to face. However, the experience that we have made is that in general it works well, and people are getting used to it very quickly, and we haven't faced, as a matter of routine, issues in conducting interviews virtually. Very
interesting. Maybe Paul, how do you do it at LafargeHolcim? I mean, quite a global company. Do you already conduct those interviews digitally, or how do you do it?
Yeah, that's right. I think it depends on the type of interview, but even before we had restrictions, travel restrictions, you know, there's some interviews that you can do remotely that make certainly, you know, I think preparation is the key, really, because I think if the interviewee understands, you know, what the issues are. If you've got the right documents and information to hand, then you can still make it work quite well. I think if you haven't prepared, it can be difficult, because then, you know, the interviewer can ask you something and you might not have access to the information or the documents or something, and it's harder. Whereas if you were actually physically with the interviewee, you'd probably have a sort of physical file of stuff where you'd have your laptop that you could show them documents on or something like that. So I think preparation is quite important, so you know what you're going to have to, what documents you have to show them, and what other information you'll have to refer to. But it can work quite well. You know, if somebody's not being cooperative, then it can be a bit harder if they're being interviewed remotely. And in the worst case, the person can even just switch off the interview and say that they had an IT issue or something. And this sometimes happens, and they didn't really. So you know, there are problems like that. I think the difficult ones you have to anticipate and as a prepare. Ideally, do them in person, or find someone in the location where they are who can do it in person if that's possible for the tricky ones.
Great. And maybe any viewers, maybe is it best practice to record such an interview, maybe an audio recording in a Swiss context?
I mean, Sasha, you have to be careful that you tell the people at the beginning you're actually recording, because otherwise it's a criminal offense. That if you record without notifying the employee, you cannot do that. So you need to tell before.
Okay, great.
And
so
to
maybe
answer the question, yes, I mean, sometimes you do that with very important ones, but in my experience, recordings are rather rare. But I'm happy to hear the opinions of the two other gentlemen.
I think they're quite rare. Yeah, I think recordings are quite rare, because if you've got, particularly if you have two interviewers, you have one asking most questions and another one taking notes. I mean, you should be able to get everything down, and a recording can sometimes make people feel a bit nervous, a bit a bit concerned. So it's generally better not to, and certainly not to do it secretly.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great.
Absolutely.
Another very interesting question is how do you handle a key interviewee who is non-cooperative? I mean, considering that the individual cooperation is the key to the investigation.
And I see the question is then, is it permitted to pretend to have incriminating evidence against him? And I think I would always say that an interviewer, an investigator, should not lie and make things up. I think that would not be ethical, not be something we would want to do. Whether that would be legal or not, I think it's not an ethical way to proceed. But clearly, if somebody is not cooperating, then, you know, as I mentioned, it's worth putting it to them that, well, yeah, we do have information from other sources, quite likely, and therefore it may not look good if that person doesn't cooperate, given the other information we have. I don't think we can pretend to have something that we don't.
I fully agree with you, Paul. I mean, you have to make sure that you're not falling into the criminal offense of coercion by actually forcing to disclose something. But as you said, I mean, in the end, it's in the employee's own interest to cooperate, to give his own view. And as I mentioned, in the end, you can direct him. And if he's not cooperating, you can sanction him until the termination of the contract. And if he's willing to go that route, then so be it. But you can do it in a fair way, but still get the information.
I agree with both of you, and in particular, I think be sincere, don't lie, be fair, ask the tough questions. It comes down to these principles, and experience shows that with these principles, you usually get to your objective, which is to uncover and find facts.
Great. Any other remark? Otherwise, another great question: should HR representatives participate in an interview or even conduct them alongside compliance? Interesting question. What do you think, guys?
Maybe I can answer that one. Yes, I think it's very important if you have, let's say, a very investigation is very much focused on HR topics, let's say Me Too or sexual harassment, and you have a dedicated HR function which is actually very trained in doing specific investigation. I think it's a very good idea to have them on board. Of course, they need to be trained, they need to be experienced in interviewing and to adhere to investigation policies or whatsoever. But I think depending on the kind of investigation, I think it's a great thing to have HR on board. It is another question if then they are also ones who decide on the sanction, let's say in a disciplinary committee. So because then you are mixing investigating and sanctioning, and I think there you should have a clear separation.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's right, Daniel. I think on HR-related topics, it's always best to have the expert, the person who with the greatest expertise in the topic, involved in the investigation. So if it is an HR topic such as harassment, discrimination, something of that type, then you would normally want to involve HR. Equally, in other topics, you wouldn't necessarily want HR involved, except that they may then be involved later on in the disciplinary side once a conclusion has been reached. But you wouldn't want them involved in the evaluation of something, for example, a fraud investigation or a bribery investigation. That probably wouldn't be something you would involve HR in at the beginning.
Oliver, how do you see it maybe at FIFA?
Yeah,
Is HR involved sometimes?
As Daniel and Paul both said, depends on the topic, and usually you would want to have the subject matter experts involved in the interview. So if it is a topic as sexual harassment, Me Too, etc., then it makes for sure sense to have HR involved. Whereas if you have a financial fraud topic, then maybe you'd rather have your financial experts involved, or your colleagues from compliance if it concerns a trade sanctions breach or something like that.
Great. Another question, what is your preferred method to communicate to an interviewee to keep the content of the interview confidential and not to talk with colleagues about it? I mean, it's a very practical question. Maybe Daniel?
I mean, yes, you always have that. Let's say it's a witness interview and not a suspect. I mean, usually I told the people at the end that it's in their own interest that they do not speak about it. I mean, you can actually direct them as an order or like a direction that they keep it confidential, but you cannot control it. Therefore, it makes more sense if they by themselves have the insight that it's maybe better for them not to discuss it with anyone. So to have a need to know principle, and usually people got that. Because they don't want to have the big noise in the company. So I think it's in their own interest not to keep the information very limited, the audience very limited.
Paul, maybe last remark?
Yeah, I think it's very important that confidentiality is the key point really on both sides. Everyone has to understand it's confidential and that people can speak openly and that confidentiality will be maintained.
Okay, it's also great. Confidentiality leads to trust, and I think with building trust, the interview success stands and falls. So it's key indeed.
Yes.
Okay, thank you guys. Unfortunately, we have to stop the Q&A at this point as our session is coming to an end. We had lots of questions and we will reach out to you to answer them. Thank you very much for your interest, for your active participation. I want to thank again our speakers and especially all the participants for your engagement. Thanks for the insights, and please feel free now also to join the networking table after this session. And I'm very happy to hand over now to the moderator. Thank you, guys.